Welcome back to Train Signal Citrix XenApp Training. You're watching Citrix Policies In-Depth Look lesson. Oh, Eli, you only have one thing in this lesson. So here's a word of caution. This is a good time to go get a cup of coffee, maybe get a pop, get something to munch on, because while I only have one slide in this lesson, I'm about to fry your brain with the amount of information that I'm going to give you. We are going to take an in-depth look at the different settings of the Citrix policies, the different settings that are available. So we're going to talk about a lot of settings here. So again, get a cup of coffee, get a pop. This is going to be an interesting lesson. So before we go ahead and get started with the policies, I wanted to make sure you understand the difference and how it's going to be broken up into. So there are two types of policies that you have with Citrix policies. There's the computer policies, which affect XenApp servers in general. And these policies have different categories. You have the ICA, you have licensing, you have server settings, virtual IP, XML service. And then you have the user policies. User policies will always apply to incoming users or incoming sessions into the XenApp server, and those will also have different categories. You have one main category, so to speak, but you have a lot of subcategories under that, and you'll notice they are all listed here. So are you guys ready? Let's go ahead and dig into Citrix policies. Back on our XenApp 01 server here, we have the Delivery Services console open. We're on the Policies node, and we're going to start off by taking a more in-depth look at both the computer Citrix policies and the user Citrix policies. For now, we're going to start off with computer, and I'm going to select one of the policies here. We're going to click on Edit so that we can get to the settings. Let's go ahead and expand this for a better view. And we're going to start off with the different categories that we have here, but we're going to start off with ICA. Now, the ICA listener connection is a service that exists on every XenApp server, on every RDS server and terminal server in general. And the functionality of this listener service, or it's a listener port, is to wait for an incoming connection. When it has a session that's incoming, or you have a user with an incoming connection, it takes that user and connects them to a session and goes back into an idle state to wait for another user to come in and takes that user and makes a connection. Think of it as like a taxi for sessions. It waits, so it's when users are connected, it has no function after the connection is established. So there could be users on the XenApp server that are working. This service in general, its functionality, its purpose of existence in life is to wait for an incoming connection from a user, take that user and connect them to a session, go back into an idle state. So what you can do here is you can adjust the listener connection timeout. By default, I believe it's set to 120,000 milliseconds, so you can feel free to adjust this. In general, we don't touch this. This is a default setting. It's fine unless there's a specific reason to adjust this value. You should leave it at its default. The ICA protocol is always listening on port 1494. Again, unless there's a specific reason to change this port, this should be left at its default. If we look at the auto client reconnect here, if you wanted to allow auto client reconnects when there's a disconnection on the network, and the disconnection on the network can happen for any number of reasons. Drop packets, you lose a switch. For whatever the reason is for the user to lose connection with the server, do you want to allow that session to automatically reconnect the user when the network is established? If you want to allow that, then what you have to do is, and we've made this change before, so what you have to do is either allow or prohibit. In this case, you probably want to allow users to reconnect to a disconnected session when that happens. So that's probably good practice. And then what you're asking in the second setting here, which is a requirement, if you enable, the only time you would enable this is once you've turned on auto client reconnect. What you're saying here is, what do you want to do with a disconnected session when it reconnects? Now, technically, the user has disconnected. If the user has walked away from their PC or have gone, and this session automatically reconnects, this could pose a security issue because now this session is technically open for anyone to do whatever they need with it. So depending on the environment, depending on the application, and also depending on where you're applying this policy to, is it to a secure environment, is it to a non-secure environment, you will make that determination. So some of the options that you have is to reprompt the user to log in with the username and password in the event that a disconnected session is reconnected. Now keep in mind, this could also be a hassle. If you're on a network that is constantly dropping users, or if the users are coming in over the internet or over a wireless connection that is constantly dropping them, and they have to reconnect and re-authenticate every time, then this will become a quick hassle and generate a lot of help desk calls. So you have to measure the situation and apply the policy where it makes sense and not create more headaches for yourself when you don't need to. And down here, the auto client reconnect logging will basically log you'll have an event log every time there is a session that was in disconnection mode that was reconnected to the user. It will create a log for that so that there's a trail for that. End user monitoring. This helps you with troubleshooting. So what it basically does is if you enable ICA round trip calculation, you are technically sort of enabling an ICA packet to travel from the user to the server while it measures how long it takes for this ICA packet to go from the user to the server and back. Think of it as like a ping command that helps you in the troubleshooting process. So if you wanted to enable that, you could go into the setting and enable it, and then once that's enabled, let's go ahead and enable it here. You can also configure the ICA round trip calculation interval in seconds. So you're just basically giving it a, what is the interval going to be for this packet that's going back and forth between the client and the server? Typically it's set at 15 seconds unless there's a reason while you're troubleshooting to increase or decrease that. This should be enough to give you an idea of what's going on in the environment. And the last setting here is the ICA round trip calculation for idle connections. Now, you don't necessarily want to measure the performance of the ICA packet when the session is idle. When the user isn't doing anything, there is really no reason to tax the network or to constantly try to calculate that round trip when the user isn't doing anything. It's kind of pointless. So you can set here what threshold or what you want to do with an idle session from a ICA round trip calculation perspective. Typically this is set to disabled. You don't want to measure it when it's in idle mode. So you're going to click on OK to enable that or disable that. Now from a graphics perspective, and keep in mind all the settings that we're doing here, those are typically server settings. So we are configuring everything at the server level. So what do you want to do from a display memory limit? Typically this is a buffer for the graphics. In most cases, users will never, or I won't say never, but users will not fill this buffer. But in the event that they do fill this buffer, what do you want the server to do? So once you've configured this to the value that you want, now in the second value down here, which is display mode degrade preference, you are telling the server what to do in the event that the users bump up against the buffer here. So what you can do is one of two things. You can either degrade the color depth, or you can degrade the resolution limit, or you can degrade the resolution first so that you can improve the session first of all, and that you can lower the buffer that's been filled up here, and that will improve the user experience automatically. Image caching, this basically deals with how much image caching do you want to allow or not allow. This is generally a very good idea to allow image caching so that the same bits, the same data doesn't necessarily have to always travel that WAN connection or that LAN connection down to the user. If you're able to cache the images, you want to cache those images. Maximum allowed color depth. This is very, very important because the higher the color depth, the more data you're going to transmit. And in some cases, if you don't have enough bandwidth, this could cause serious user experience, serious latency, serious refresh issues. The user experience will just be bad overall. So determine what is the acceptable color depth that you can give an application while maintaining a decent user experience, and only send that amount of data through the wire. So obviously 32-bit is the maximum, and that's going to be you're sending a lot of data, you're refreshing a lot of data at the client side. So if you can get away with 16-bit or 15-bit, absolutely go for it. If the application will still perform, if the colors are there and the user is happy, then go with the least amount possible, and I'll let you guys make the determination based on the applications and the users you have. Typically you could probably get away with 16-bit. If you can do that, that would be advisable. Now, the other thing that you want to note here is notify users when display mode is degraded. So up here, we selected or we specified what you want to do in the event that the buffer gets filled, and how do you clear the buffer or help lower that value. And we specified that we want to lower the resolution or lower the color depth. Now, when the user sees this, if you don't have notify user that this is happening, it might take the user by surprise. So what you probably want to do is you want to enable notify of the user, so that the user knows, okay, look, there's a problem between your client and the server, and as such, we've degraded your color depth, so just be aware that this is the reason why maybe the screen changed or the colors changed. This could avoid a potential call to the help desk, even though they'll probably call anyway. Queuing and tossing, this will deal with what you want to do when you're queuing images and there's a new image or an updated image that comes in. Do you want to toss that image and keep the updated one or the updated version in the queue? So this deals with that. You probably want to enable that as well. Keep alives. Keep alives are interesting, and I recommend that you always enable keep alives for the simple reason that when you're establishing a session between a client and a server, if you don't have an ICA keep alive and the user walks away to get a cup of coffee or something, the network layer will automatically detect that there is no packet, there's nothing being exchanged between point A and point B, and will deconstruct that session. What the ICA keep alive allows you to do is it allows some kind of a packet, some kind of a message packet that is constantly traversing the link between the client session and the server session, preventing the network from deconstructing that session because it thinks that nothing is going on. Now, by default, this is a very good idea to be enabled. It increases session stability and better user experience. By default, this should have a 60-second value, so you want to enable that. And you probably want to also enable the general ICA keep alive here. So the first you enable it, this is like a master toggle switch. You want to send ICA keep alive messages. Click OK, and then you set the threshold. Some of these should be in reverse, but since we're going through them, and then up here you set the timeout for the ICA keep alive. Now down here with multimedia, and we're going to talk about these because you'd have to enable it at the client level as well, but this is all for HDX multimedia. So if you wanted to enable streaming audio and video to users, these are all settings that would allow you to do that. So if you go into to add here, and now you're allowing HDX to stream that media, that video, that audio from your servers down to your users and where it's processing. So all of these settings are going to have to do with where you're processing this data and how you're delivering it to the user. So if I click on OK here to enable that, the second option here is the buffer. So you want to set your buffer sizes. By default, it's set to 5 seconds. And down here you have the default buffer size, which will also be enabled in order for these settings to take effect. Now, with regards to multimedia conferencing, this is important if you're trying to use webcams or microphones or video cams and so on and so forth, and you want to allow that through your session. Then you want to enable this on your Zen app in order to allow that type of traffic to pass through. Now, again, there will be equivalent settings that we would need to modify and configure at this client side that would enable all of these features to properly work. The security policy or the security setting here is interesting because depending on the environment you're in, if it's a high security environment or an acceptable security environment, if I can call it, you might want to disable the ability for users to seamlessly go from the web interface to their published applications by passing their credentials through, so to speak. So if you're in a high security environment, you might not want to pass those credentials through, and you want to prompt the user to put in the username and password every time they go in from a hop. So for example, they're entering their username and password, and then they first log into their computer, then they visit the web interface server, they're putting in their username and password there, they're clicking on your published application, it comes up with a username and password, and again to connect there. So if you wanted that level of security, then you would want to enable this feature. For most of us, this feature is an annoyance that generates significant amount of calls, so this should remain a default, which is disabled. Now you can configure a policy for specific Zen app servers or specific applications where you're enabling this if it's an application that requires extreme high security. Now, the session or the server limits here basically says how long are you willing to accept an idle user. An idle user is a user that has an established connection but isn't doing anything with that session. They're not interacting with the mouse or the keyboard. The session is completely idle. How long do you want me to keep an established session when the user is idle? Now keep in mind, idle users will take away resources from users that are actually doing work. So an idle session will still take out CPU resources, memory resources, disk resources, so on and so forth. So these users are consuming valuable resources that they're taking away from their colleagues while they're not doing anything. So it's a very good idea to set an idle timeout interval here. So you can click on Add, and you can set this in milliseconds. So for example, if the user isn't doing anything with that session for 30 minutes or an hour, it is a good idea to disconnect that user from the session. Now, there's a couple of different things you can do, and we'll talk about that when we get into the user settings, but you can put the user in disconnected state, and then after that you can log them off. So there are certain things that you can do in order to relieve some of these resources that the user isn't using. Session reliability. Session reliability is another set of settings that you should enable that would help the user experience and improve the session quality. What session reliability allows you to do is, let's say you're working on your laptop and you go through a tunnel, and you lose connectivity with the network when you're in that tunnel. So instead of dropping your session completely, the session will sort of freeze. And when the user comes out of the tunnel and the network is established, it will automatically allow the user to continue to work. So instead of disconnecting the session and then having to reconnect the session or trying to reconnect the session, it maintains that session during the network outage. And when network connectivity is reestablished, it allows the user to continue to work off of that session. So it'll kind of freeze that session for a little bit there. So if you wanted to use session reliability, first thing we're going to do is we're going to have to enable it by allowing it. And then once it's enabled, the default port number for session reliability is 2598. Unless there's a reason you shouldn't change that, you probably want to memorize this number if you intend on taking the CCA exam. And then you have the session reliability timeout here, and the default value is 180 seconds. Unless you need to change that, that should be a good default value that you have. Now, from a shadowing perspective, this will enable shadowing on this particular server. So we have shadowing allowed on the server. And then from a licensing perspective, you're setting your license server. This is important because you're setting a license server, and you're applying, don't forget, you're applying this policy to the worker group. So all the servers in this worker group are going to get the same license server host name. So you can come in here and pretty much type it. In our case, it's CTX LIC01. You can do fully qualified domain name, you can do short name, or you can do an IP address. And unless you need to, you don't need to change the port that it's listening on. It's typically port 27,000. Then we move on to the server settings. Now under server settings, you have the ability to control where the user is connecting from. So connection access control, once you click on that, you are basically saying, I'm willing to accept any connection from anywhere. Now, if you're applying this policy because these set of XenApp servers, you only want to allow access to them from a Citrix Access Gateway, you can limit access to the server, to this group of servers, only from Access Gateway, or you can select Citrix Access Gateway, online plugin, web interface, so on and so forth. For the most part, unless there's a need to, this should remain at any connection. DNS address resolution, for the most part, a lot of times the XenApp servers can pass DNS resolution to clients through the XML port. So it'll provide sort of DNS services to end clients that might be in an area where DNS isn't readily available or isn't available to them. You can pass the DNS resolution information through the XML port. This could be a useful setting to enable. I typically enable this as well. Full icon caching, you probably want to do full icon caching to reduce the amount of icons that could unnecessarily be retransmitting between the server and the client every time retransmitting the same icons. So if you have the ability to cache those icons and allow the session to have less traffic to deal with, you definitely want to do that. XenApp Product Edition, this is extremely important. And for those of you that remember XenApp 5 and 4.5 and 4 and 3.0, this would typically be in the Access Management Console, typically in that middle column there. But in XenApp 6 and on, it's a part of the policy. So depending on the XenApp server license edition that you have, you want to modify this. In our case, we have Enterprise License, so we're going to go ahead and select that. And then we're going to move on to connection limits. So you could limit the number of user sessions that connect to the server. You typically don't want to do that, but if there was a need to limit the number of users that connect to the server because of licensing or for whatever reason that you need to limit the number of users that connect to the server, you can do this here. And when you're limiting the number of connections to a user, don't forget that their disconnected sessions will also count as a session. When they shadow, that also counts as a session. So it's not just their connected session, it's also their disconnected session, and any sessions they're shadowing also counts against them. Now, if you enable these settings, you have the ability to limit that for the administrators as well. Now, for administrators, I generally don't recommend this because administrators need the ability to shadow users, need the ability to have multiple sessions. If you limit this, it could have a negative effect, especially for administrators that have a need for a lot of sessions to manage the environment. And the final setting here is logging of logon limits to servers. This is probably a good idea. If you've enabled limit the user, then you want to know how many users are going over that limit and how many requests are coming in. So you want those event logs that tell you, yeah, you're bumping up against the number here. You probably want to increase it or decrease it. For whatever reason, you want to log it if you enable that particular setting. Now, some of the settings that we have here, we're not going to talk about in this lesson. I'm going to leave them for other lessons. So I'm not going to talk about health monitoring. We're not going to talk about memory, CPU, offline, or reboot. But I do want to talk about virtual IP for a little bit. So what virtual IP is used for is specifically for application. Now, for the most part, the application doesn't understand or doesn't care which IP address you are connecting from. However, in some cases, in some instances, you may have applications like a point of sale or a teller at a bank, so on and so forth, where the application understands IPs and expects that the user is coming in from a specific IP address. This could also be for security reasons. But virtual IPs in general are geared towards applications that require a specific IP address or expect the same IP address over and over and over again. Otherwise, the user will always have a different IP address. Now, the other thing to mention here is that there's a lot of settings for virtual IPs. For the most part, you probably won't use virtual IPs. If you are going to use virtual IPs, these are all the different settings that you can configure for that particular configuration of your application. And the last thing that we have here is the XML service. You can always trust requests to XML if you have the SSL infrastructure in place and you see that there's a need to have the XML communication between the servers trusted. You can go ahead and enable that. By default, that's disabled. I typically leave it disabled, so unless there's a particular need for it, you should probably leave this as disabled as well. The XML service port by default will run on port 80. I have it shared with IIS. So we are sharing port 80 with IIS for XML. Citrix, this is disabled by default. Citrix recommends using port 8080 if you enable this particular setting. All right, and that's it for the XenApp server settings configuration in the computer settings. So I'm going to go ahead and save those right now. And let's go in and take a look at the user settings that we have here. By editing this policy, let's take a look at what we've got. Now, you'll notice that in user settings, you have a lot more settings to work with. So we're going to start with ICA. And what you have here is we're going to talk a lot about ICA here, and we're going to talk about the different virtual channels within the ICA protocol that we talked about in earlier lessons. So the first thing you're going to notice here is client clipboard redirection. So the client clipboard redirection, if you enable that, then you're allowing the users to do copy and paste or cut and paste between the server and the client and the server. Now, this might be okay on your LAN, and it probably is a good setting to have enabled because it improves the user experience. But in a lot of cases, I've seen companies, and we've disabled it in environments of high security, where if the user is connecting from home, you don't want to allow them to do a copy and paste because maybe they're dealing with sensitive information, and copy and paste is a a way of extracting information from the server. So you might want to disable clipboard, you might want to disable printing. So depending on where they're connecting from, this setting might be enabled or disabled. For the purposes of this demonstration, we're just going to keep this enabled at this point. The desktop launches here. This is interesting because this will allow or prohibit users from launching published desktops. Right now it's set to disabled, which means users cannot launch published desktops. Typically, if you're publishing these desktops, you want your users to be able to connect to them, you want to allow the setting. So this is very important from a published desktop perspective. So if we enable this, here you have the ability of also not allowing users to launch published applications from within desktops. Now, what does that mean? So typically, you should know if you're publishing a desktop that you'll have more, the user will see all of the applications that are typically installed on that desktop. However, Citrix gives you a way of not allowing the user to launch applications that you haven't explicitly published outside of that desktop. So let's say outside of the desktop you have only published Microsoft Office in terms of Excel and Word, and you've only given the user access to Word and Excel. If you publish a desktop, now the user can see Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Access. Typically, if they click on PowerPoint, they're going to get access to it, right? However, if you enable this policy here, then you are basically saying, if I haven't explicitly published that application and given you access to it, then even though you see it in the published desktop, I am not allowing you to launch that application. So this is a very helpful tool that you can use here. OEM channels, this allows third-party or OEM to use virtual channels within the ICA protocol, or to construct virtual channels within the ICA protocol. Unless there's a need for that, unless you have to enable that, you'll know if you have a particular application or particular set of drivers that would need those virtual channels, and you can enable it at that point. Now let's talk about file redirection here. File redirection is interesting. The first thing you want to do is, are you going to allow the client drives, the drives that are on your local client, to be available through the session? So if you're going to allow client drives, you're going to have to enable the session first, which allows the client drives. And then you want to enable auto connection of these drives. So first you enable it, and then you allow automatic connection of the client drive. So if you enable automatic connection, then it will connect these drives for you. Client fixed drives like C and D and E, etc. You can connect the client floppy drives. You can connect client network drives, client optical drives, removable drives. So basically any drive that is available, that is visible on the client, you are making available through that session. So you have a lot of different options in here. Host to client redirection. This one is interesting because let's say the client that the users are connecting from has internet access. You are able to redirect certain things instead of executing at the host level. So for example, instead of opening a web page through the XenApp server session and going out to the internet, if the user clicks on a particular media type, it can redirect that to launch from the client's machine, whether it's a thin client, whatever it is, and connect through the local machine. So if it's you're going to a website or a flash page or a YouTube or a video, instead of streaming that through the server, you're saying, I want to automatically redirect certain aspects through the client. So this could be very useful as well. You can enable that or disable it. Preserve client drive letters. So this one is interesting. Let's say you're connecting from the client and the client has an I drive or an H drive or an S drive or an M drive. If there is capability, if it's possible, I want you to preserve those drive letters. So, and the way you preserve those drive letters is when it tries to map those drive letters in the server, if those drive letters are available, then it will map them. If those drive letters are being used on the server, then it's going to give the users another set of letters. So you typically want to enable preserve client drive letters. Special folder redirection. This will need to be in conjunction with more settings that you do in Active Directory, but this would allow you to redirect more folders than the typical folder redirection would allow you to do. More settings, more profile folders that you can get a little more granular than what the traditional folder redirection would allow you to do. Use asynchronous writes. Now, asynchronous writes will obviously improve the performance of your writes between the server and the client. However, be very careful when you're enabling asynchronous. You want to make sure that you have a very reliable connection between your client and your server before you enable asynchronous connection. Let's go here to graphics. And let's select image compression. Now, image compression will allow the session to improve the performance by compressing the different images, the different graphic elements that are in that session in order to improve the user's experience. And it does that in 3 different compression methods. You have the lossy compression, you have the progressive compression, and you have the progressive heavyweight compression. Now, each of those will kick in based on a different threshold. When a different network threshold is sort of breached, if we can say, then the first one will kick in and start compressing those images in order to improve the performance of the session overall. So what you want to do first, if you're interested in image compression, is you want to enable it, and you can enable it by setting, well, how much do you want to compress? You don't want to do compression low, medium, high. By default, it's set to medium. So let's assume that is acceptable. If you click on OK, then here you are setting the threshold that you want this to kick in at. So if you add it, by default, it's going to kick in when this threshold is breached. Do you want progressive compression to happen? If you do want progressive compression to happen, then you click on Add. And again, you select it from the drop-down menu here. You could do ultra high, very high, so on and so forth. Let's say you wanted to do medium. Select medium here. Again, you would have to set the threshold against which you want this setting to kick in. When do you want this setting to kick in? You can specify that here. And finally, you have the progressive heavyweight compression. Now, with the progressive heavyweight compression, it doesn't necessarily, you don't lose quality of the image. Now, whenever you're doing compression of an image, you are going to have to give, something's going to have to give, right? So if it's compressing the image quality will be lower, but then you don't have to transmit as much data, so the session performance increases. Now, with progressive heavyweight, what happens is the image quality is preserved. However, significant CPU resources are needed at the server level in order to do all the algorithms on the server level and transmit back to the client, preserving the image quality but sacrificing significant CPU resources on the server. So be very careful when enabling this setting. You should have enough CPU to make sure you can handle all of the sessions that are running and all the programs and applications that are running on your server, and in addition to that, be able to handle the compression amount that you are throwing at it. Now, from a multimedia perspective, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the HDX media streams as well that we have for Flash. Now, if you have applications that are Flash intensive, you'll notice here that we have 2 options. We have do it at the client side and do it on the server side. Now, this is very important. If you have the ability to render the Flash at the client side, then you want to render that at the client side because you'll have better performance. So the first thing you want to do is, hey, do you want to enable the flash acceleration? If you want to enable flash acceleration, you are going to enable this setting first. Now, once you've enabled it, do you want to log events about flash settings? Typically, if you want to do that, you can enable the logging mechanisms here. Latency thresholds, you can set the latency threshold for flash. Typically, it's at 39 milliseconds. And now what you can do with Flash server-side content fetching is you can determine which content you want to render at the server level and which content you want to render at the client level. There might be some content that's better rendered at the client level, and you can whitelist that or blacklist that so that certain websites open up at the client and certain other websites open up at the server. So you're going to make that determination based on the server, based on the servers, based on your capabilities. If you have the capability of running at the client level, then you should do that. And if you want to do certain websites on the server, certain websites on the client, then you have the ability of configuring blacklists and whitelists so that you can determine which sites will run on the server level and which ones will run at the client level. Now, if you click here on the Flash for server, you have the ability of adjusting the Flash quality at the server level, and you can do sort of the compression algorithms again for optimizing Flash animations, and you have several different options that you can choose from here. Ports will give you the ability of auto connecting COM ports, for whatever applications that still use COM ports. You can auto connect client COM ports. You can do auto connect LPT ports if you have them. The client port redirection. This is, and again, another virtual channel. Typically, if you're not using these should be disabled in order to disable more virtual channels. If you don't want it, or for security reasons, you don't want a user to be able to plug in a printer that is locally attached via an LPT port, you might want to disable that. That way you're only forcing the user to use network printers, and you're not allowing them to plug in a local printer and then print from that local printer from the session. So these are certain things you can enable COM and LPT, and then you can automatically connect them if you choose to do so. Printing, we're going to leave printing for a later lesson. We're going to spend extensive time on printing and security, but let's go here to session limits. Now, we talked a little bit about session limits when we were looking at the XenApp or the computer Citrix policies, and some of these overlap. So what you're doing here is you're determining what you want to do with session limits. How many concurrent logons do you want to allow? Typically, you might want to set a limit on this if it's licensing related, if maybe there's an application on this particular server and you only want to limit 10 users at a time, or you want to limit how many times one user can concurrently connect. How many concurrent connections that user can have, you can limit that here. Disconnection timed out settings. So this one is interesting, and depending on who you ask, they will give you a different answer, right? So what do you want to do if the user session has been disconnected? Now, the disconnect could be a tool that works for your benefit, or it is a tool that works against you. For advanced users, if you've given users enough education on how to disconnect the session, why to disconnect the session, it could be your friend. Because let's say a user wants to take a break for lunch. They don't want to necessarily log off of the XenApp server, but at the same time, they want to be responsible and understand that if they stay connected, then they're taking away resources from other colleagues. So what they can do in that case is they can put their session in disconnected state. They can click on the X, for example, that will automatically disconnect the session. When they come back from lunch, they try to reconnect again. They connect back to that session. They continue to work. Now, this is if you've given your users enough education and enough training to understand how to use the disconnected session. In most cases, what I've seen is this could be a tool that works against you because the users don't know what they're doing, and they either clicked on the X and they don't know what that is. They thought maybe they logged off, or their session literally something happened and it disconnected. Now, if you don't set a disconnected session timer, that session can go on disconnected for a long period of time. You'll very quickly have many users in disconnected state. Those help desk calls will pile up. Hey, can you reset my session? Can you reset my session? Or I can't connect. So typically in environments that I've built, I usually like to set this to, first of all, I'd like to enable it. And after you enable it, you want to set an interval, and usually I like to set that interval to about 5 minutes. So if you set that to 5 minutes, that should be enough time. After 5 minutes, if the user doesn't connect back to the session, it will automatically log them off so that when they click on the icon again, it will connect them. Session connection timer. This one we typically never configure. So session connection timer basically says this user is allowed to use my resource, my system, for X amount of time. So whether or not they're idle, they're disconnected or not, even if they're doing work, I am not allowing you to do work for more than 1 hour. So you are setting a limit on how long that session can be established. Unless there's a very compelling reason, these settings should not be enabled. The idle session timer, we talked about that. How long do you want the user to be idle before you disconnect their session? So this one I would recommend you enable. It's enabled here. And then I would recommend you also set an interval for it. So for example, you could allow the user to be idle for 30 minutes, or you can allow the user to be idle for 60 minutes, or in worst case scenario 2 hours, maybe 4 hours if they're really pushing it. But if a user is idle for 2 hours, they're consuming a lot of resources that other people could be taking advantage of. If they're idle for 2 hours, they should be logged off and they can reconnect when they come back. That is my take on it, but again, based on your policies, based on what you have going on inside the company and the way you're using XenApp, that will dictate what you're doing with the idle timers. Let's scroll down here and see what else we've got. Shadowing. So we've enabled shadowing when we were configuring the computer settings. Now it's time to basically configure shadowing. So if you enable input from shadow connections, then you're allowing the user that's shadowing, the shadowy user, to interact with their session. So if I'm shadowing you and you're like, can you show me how to do this? I can at least move your mouse, type in things on your keyboard, on my keyboard, that I can register against your session. So typically you want this enabled, as that would help in the troubleshooting process, and that's kind of why you're doing shadowing in the first place. Log shadow attempts. If you want to create an event log for every time a shadow attempt happens, then you probably want to enable that as well. Notify user of pending shadow connection. This I like to enable by default. Now again, depending on some of the policies within your organization, you might enable or disable that. As a matter of principle, a matter of ethics if you want, in some organizations, if you are trying to shadow a user, then that user should be notified that someone is looking over your shoulder. Do you want to allow or disallow that user from shadowing you? Again, by default, that should be enabled so that to preserve user privacy and everything, that you're allowing the user to say yes or no to be shadowed. In some organizations, and depending on what you're doing, you might want this disabled so that you're able to look and see at what the user is doing without their knowing or their consent, for that matter. Users who can shadow other users. Here you're specifying which user group can shadow, which user group can initiate shadows. And later on in other lessons, we're going to talk about the shadow taskbar, which is a nice GUI, and it's a nice tool that allows you to easily shadow users. But let's say, and you can enable shadowing for help desk. That's almost the default. And in our case, I've created a group called CTX help desk that we want to enable or give shadow access to. Now, in your case, you might have, or you might want to give the shadow capabilities to some of your power users as well. So you might have a group of users within the user community that might be advanced users that know the CRM application better, and in order to alleviate some of the headaches that are going to the help desk with all these support calls, what we've done with some companies is, depending, if you have an organization that spreads out over a lot of different offices in different regions, every region has one or two power users that users can contact first if it's an application related issue. How do you do something within the CRM application? You can contact that power user, and that power user has the ability of initiating a shadow session in order to help you through a particular issue. So that might be another reason why you want to give power user shadow ability. Now, by the same token, what you can do is you can give shadow capabilities to everyone. You give it to domain users, give it to authenticated users, but you can then limit the users that are not allowed to shadow. So you can blacklist some users and say, okay, well, I don't want this group of users to be able to shadow, and you can follow the same process by adding those groups of users and disabling or not allowing them from shadowing. Time zone control is very important. What time zone control allows you to do is, if you have users in different geographical areas or in different time zones that are connecting into your XenApp servers. Typically, the XenApp servers are going to have the time zone of where they're at. So if they're in Chicago, they're going to have Central Standard Time. Now, if someone's connecting from China, they're going to get the time on their session of Chicago. Now, you don't necessarily want to do this, sometimes because of applications, sometimes because of logging, it's going to log the wrong time and you won't know when that change was made, etc., etc. So what you want to do is enable local time estimation, which allows that framework of enabling the time based on the user's device. So if the user is connecting from a PC, a laptop, a thin client, whatever the device where the session is being initiated from, you want to grab that local time and pass it through the session. So instead of using server time zone, you want to use the client time zone, and in that case, when you do this, now the user is able to see their time zone when they're logged into the XenApp server. Twain devices, these are devices that you enable if you are giving support or extending support to scanners. Anything that needs a Twain driver, basically, you would want to come in here and tweak these settings so that you can enable that. USB devices, This is also interesting. You're enabling access to USB devices. Now, with USB devices, it's very interesting, and you have to pay attention to what you're enabling and what you're not enabling with client devices. First, you have the option of enabling it. Down here, certain USB devices could, for example, if you plug in a USB device that is a wireless network, you can possibly pass that wireless network into your ZenApp session, thereby creating several different wireless networks that you don't want to exist. So by default, what ZenApp has done here is that it's taken certain classes of USB devices and automatically denied them access through a ZenApp session. So for example, you'll notice here hub devices. I don't want to allow USB hub devices to be connected through my session, so on and so forth. If you scroll through this list, you'll notice that they've disabled a lot of these devices for you, and then they've allowed certain devices that are generally acceptable. Now you can always add, edit, delete, move up or down these devices based on, if things change, if new devices come out, you can always come in here and modify these settings to your liking. Down here, you are basically enable client USB plug-in play device redirection. So you can click on that and you can allow or prohibit that from happening. And finally, the server session settings here. These last two items we're not going to talk about. These are the topics for possibly another training DVD. This is for single sign-on, another product, another extended feature of the Platinum License Edition that we're not covering in this series of lessons. But session importance, this one we'll come back and visit later on. But what this means is if you wanted to give a particular session more importance than other sessions because your CFO or your CEO or the management team in general are connecting. When they connect, you want to be able to give their sessions better access to the CPU, better access to memory, more resources, give them more importance basically so that their user experience, is a little more enhanced. It's not fair technically, but if their user experience is more enhanced, then you can go ahead and click on add in order to enable that particular value, and you can give it low, medium, or high. Now, this setting will be used in conjunction with the CPU management or the CPU utilization management, and we're going to talk about that in later lessons, but I wanted to show you where you can enable it within the settings. So we click on OK here. Whew! This was a long lesson. Let's go ahead and save. Let's go back to our presentation and recap what we've learned in this lesson. So for those of you that are still around and that are still watching the conclusion of this lesson and how I'm going to end it, I'm not going to go through an entire recap of the different settings, so don't worry, we're not going to go through this again. But basically what we went through during this lesson is we went through the different policy rules. We talked about the different computer rules or different computer settings that are available for computer policies, and then we also went through different rules and settings that are available from a user perspective. So your ZenApp servers and your sessions that are incoming into the ZenApp servers, and how you can configure and improve the performance of your sessions and your overall user experience by tweaking some of these settings. I hope this lesson was informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.